These are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Source webinar. Thank you for your patience. We will go ahead and dive right in today. Wishing you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. And we're really pleased to have you all join us for the Sharing Ocean Acidification Resources for Communicators and Educators webinar series. So the Source webinar is presented by NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries and NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program. And our goal is to provide ocean acidification communication tools to formal and informal educators and stakeholders across the country to promote a more integrated and effective ocean acidification education community. The title of today's presentation is The Olympic Coast as a Sentinel. And I'll be moderating today's session. My name is Jennifer Mintz. I am the outgoing Education and Outreach Coordinator for the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program. And I'll be moderating with Liz Parati, who is OAP's new Education and Outreach Coordinator, along with Laura Francis, an Education Coordinator with the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. So thanks again for being here. We're really glad to have over 140 registrants for today's webinar from all around the states and parts of the globe. It's a great mix of scientists and educators, all sharing that common interest in communicating ocean acidification impacts and solutions. One moment as I So we do invite you during the presentation to type any questions related to technical issues or questions for our presenter into the questions box, which you'll find in the bottom of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. All participants are in listen-only mode, so this is the way to communicate with the host and presenter today, this questions box. We'll be monitoring incoming questions and we'll respond to them or pose them to our speaker at the end of her presentation. And we always welcome your input on who you would like to see as a future Source webinar speaker or what topics or resources you'd like us to cover in upcoming webinars. If you have ideas for us, those too are welcome to be shared in the questions box, and we'll take those into consideration as we look ahead in the Source series. We are recording the session, and we'll share the recording with all of those who registered via Google Drive and on the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program YouTube channel. As we get started, we'd like to understand your current role. So please let us know what you consider yourself. And if you fall into the other category, please go ahead and share that in our questions box. And as that's coming in, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker, Meg Chadsey, who we are very, very pleased to have with us today. She is an ocean acidification specialist for Washington Sea Grant, where she serves as a resource on ocean acidification science, policy, and outreach for tribes, government agencies, academic institutions, marine industries, and the public. She also serves as Sea Grant's liaison to NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, which is a unique important appointment that was created to facilitate the flow of NOAA's world-class ocean acidification research to the greater scientific community and the public. So I think we have our poll respondents coming in. So Meg, I will go ahead and hand it over to you and also share who we have with us today. So Meg, we've got a great mix of folks with us. We've got a third educators, a few science communicators, a third are scientists and researchers, and we also have a great variety that fall into that other category. So let's see here. So Meg, can you hear and see us? I think we'll take you off mute. So Meg, if you can.
Oh, I think I did
and
it.
share your screen.
All right.
Yes.
Sharing my screen is the one, it says I'm sharing. No. Change presenter. How about that?
Say you're presenting. Let's try it one more time. Let me go ahead and it will disappear from you for a moment and we'll come right back at you. Give me 1 second. So, all right. See how that works.
Okay. Can you both hear me now and see hopefully just my title slide?
Yes, we can. Success.
Okay. All right, now I just have to get some of these other little doodads to close a bit. I assume you can't see the bothersome control panel on the right, so I'll just ignore that. All right. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for this opportunity. I've been anticipating giving this webinar for years, since the inception of this collaborative research project, which is depicted in the video. And also, I just want to start out with a heartfelt appreciation to Jen Mintz, who I've enjoyed working with for almost 10 years in various capacities, and I am so excited for her next steps, and I thank you, Jen, for everything you've done for OA up until this point. Okay, and for me. So without getting much more maudlin, I'll go to my next slide, I hope. Okay, next slide. There we go. This is the thumbnail title slide of the video that provides an overview of this collaborative research project, which is just wrapping up, that I'm a part of with many collaborators, and it's been going on for 3 years, 4 possibly. And I just am using this slide to let all of you in the audience know that if you didn't have time to watch the video trailer or the full-length 19-minute video before this webinar, no worries, because I'm essentially going to recapitulate the main points of the video in this presentation. I have 2 goals for this source webinar. The first is to provide you all with the oceanographic and human context for the research collaboration that is portrayed in the video. And my second goal is to equip you, especially the educators and communicators, with resources that you can use to share the science and human impacts of ocean change along the Olympic coast with your own audiences. So as we go through this presentation, the content will be interspersed with short clips from the video, because believe me, I can talk about this subject for hours and still not convey things as compellingly as my colleagues on this collaborative research project. And I also just want to put everyone at ease. You may notice a few links to resources, URLs, whatnot, as we go through these slides. And you're, of course, welcome to screen capture during this presentation, but just know that I've gathered together all these links and resources together and put them into a list on my final slide, which I will share with you at the end. And I also believe that our NOAA OAP hosts will be adding these links to the question box or the chat or something that you can see where you can copy and paste links. And of course, you'll always be able to return to these after the fact. So that's my preamble. Let's move to the next slide. Before we get into the who's and the what's of this presentation, I would want to start by establishing the where. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I am circling around the white box in the right-hand picture. This is the northwest corner of the United States, literally, and I'm beaming to you from Seattle, which is here along Washington State's inland waters, which are currently known as Puget Sound or the Southern Salish Sea. And I would like to say up front that as a resident of Seattle, an employee of the University of Washington and NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, I respectfully acknowledge that I am living and working on the unceded traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish. And the land on which the University of Washington is located also touches the shared waters of all the tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. But this isn't about me. This isn't even about Seattle. This webinar is about the outer Olympic coast out here. And this region, which is known for its high biological productivity, rugged coastline, and remoteness, is home to 4 coastal treaty tribes: the Hoh, the Makah, the Quileute tribe, and the Quinault Indian Nation, and other small rural communities. And these 4 tribal nations are really at the center of the research collaboration that's depicted in the video that I'm running through with you today. All right. So the marine waters that have sustained these indigenous nations for millennia, or in their words, since time immemorial, also share a designation as the Olympic National Marine Sanctuary. And sections of the coastline that are not part of tribal reservations are protected as part of the Olympic National Park. So there's been human presence in this region for thousands of years. There's been intense scientific focus, Western scientific focus on this region for decades. And so there is deep knowledge of this place and extensive human observation since the last ice age, and in addition to the more recent technology-assisted observations. But yet so much is unknown. This Olympic coast area is a hot spot for ocean change, ocean acidification, but also other carbon dioxide-related stressors. And we're just beginning to understand what that means for the ecosystem and for the human communities that depend on that ecosystem. So next slide, I'm going to let one of our colleagues, Olympic National Park biologist Steve Fradkin, who is in the video, say a little bit about the diversity of this region.
As the coastal ecologist at Olympic National Park, I have huge concerns about ocean acidification in terms of 65 miles of coastline, which is a biodiversity hotspot. You know, it's got more species, or arguably more species of marine invertebrates and seaweeds than any other place on the west coast of North America.
All right. Whoops. I just want to point out before I move from the slide, Steve is collecting water samples to analyze the carbonate chemistry, but the Olympic National Park is not the only entity that's collecting data in the nearshore environment. Several of the coastal tribes that were partners on this project are also contributing data to this research, as well as the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. All right, next slide. This is a short primer on ocean acidification. Our audience is usually very familiar with this topic, so I won't dwell. But ocean acidification is caused by the same thing that's driving climate change, carbon dioxide or CO2. But unlike climate change, which is a physical phenomenon where the CO2 is trapping heat on our planet the way a down jacket keeps your body warm, OA is a chemical process. And the CO2 that humans are releasing into the atmosphere is absorbed by the ocean, where it's combining with water and forming carbonic acid. And this chemical reaction is acidifying seawater and making the ocean less hospitable to many marine organisms, especially those with shells made of calcium carbonate. But out on the Olympic coast of Washington, there's another factor that is contributing to the intense ocean acidification and ocean change in this region. One of these factors, or this factor, is a natural phenomenon, and it's called upwelling. So the deep waters off of our coastal shelf are naturally higher in carbon dioxide than surface waters. And when this deep water is drawn up during the spring upwelling season, and it combines with the already acidified surface layer, and those two sources of CO2 mix to make ocean acidification more severe in this region on a seasonal basis. All right, next slide. In the Pacific Northwest, oysters are kind of the poster child of ocean acidification. They were the first to be noticed to be experiencing impacts, but this creature, a pteropod, could be the international poster child of ocean acidification. They are in all the oceans of the world. They're pelagic zooplankton, a snail that swims through the water using its foot, flapping its foot like wings. And they're an important component of marine food webs, and they're also extremely vulnerable to ocean acidification. This beautiful shell is corrodes as the water becomes more acidified. And this is happening now off the coast of Washington. It's happening in Puget Sound, and it's happening in many regions of the world. And this is just an example of one organism that is vulnerable to acidification. Here is a beautiful artwork that was actually composed out on the Olympic coast of Washington. And this is representative of some of the other species, many of which are directly vulnerable to acidification and ocean change, that live along this rocky coast. So mussels, which are bivalves and have shells of calcium carbonate like pteropods and are also vulnerable in that way. Sea urchins, echinoderms, coralline algae, crabs, of course. Fish are in this picture. They are vulnerable to acidification. There is data that they are directly affected, that their neurochemistry is affected, but of course there are also food web effects. All right. So I've established a little bit about what the ecosystem is like. What I want to tell you now is that ocean conditions along this amazing ecosystem are changing. The first 3 bullet points in this slide are not changes. These are just characteristics of the Olympic coast. There's a lot of variability through space from north to south along this coast. So the ecosystem is very varied. There's strong seasonality in the conditions. I spoke about upwelling, and that upwelling really enhances acidification at certain parts of the year. And of course, there's a very diverse ecosystem. The changes that this region is experiencing are acidification, ocean warming, also warming on land, which is affecting the health of our intertidal nearshore ecosystems, and hypoxia. And all 3 of those red bullet points are things that are linked to carbon dioxide. They're co-stressors, and they're all related to excess carbon dioxide. This map on the this graph on the right-hand side is just a way of illustrating that some of this variability. This is the seasonal variability in Aragonite saturation state, or the level of corrosiveness of seawater from ocean acidification. And you can see the warmer colors equal more corrosive water. You can see as you progress from the spring through the summer into the fall, you get some very, very low saturation state conditions that are corrosive to organisms with calcium carbonate hard parts. And that is close to shore, but it's also not consistent along the coastline. This is an example of some of that spatial variability I just spoke about. So the next slide is another clip from the video. This is one of the project team scientists, Simone Allen, talking about that one of those other co-stressors, the low levels of oxygen, which are accompanying the development of ocean acidification in this region. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, hit it, Simone.
Since the early 2000s, the sanctuary's long-term oxygen observations have been showing us how bad oxygen conditions can get on the shelf. For species such as Dungeness crabs, these animals are continuously exposed to acidified conditions, and then
whoops, I'm so sorry.
And then sometimes hit by this hammer of low oxygen conditions that can really be this 1-2 punch they can't escape from.
So next slide. This is a graphic illustration of what Simone is talking about here. So ocean acidification is present in this image. It's not spelled out, but it's there, and you can consider the pteropod poster child a reminder that acidification is part of this ecosystem now. But what this ecosystem is also experiencing more and more frequently and more severely are higher temperatures. Surface seawater temperature is rising. We've had marine heat waves recently. The heat dome that settled over the Pacific Northwest this summer was extremely dangerous to intertidal organisms that were exposed directly to the atmosphere at low tides. And then that low oxygen hypoxia condition that is also a side effect of carbon dioxide emissions, as well as a natural phenomenon that's being compounded by carbon dioxide. Those pressures are squeezing these vulnerable marine organisms into a corner, basically. There's less and less area in the water column where conditions are favorable for them. So right now, the Olympic coast is a place of multiple stressors. All right, sorry, this is me. I grew up in Washington State, and I have always been in love with the ocean. But in my lifetime, I have noticed changes to this environment. But if I've seen those in my lifetime, imagine what those who live along and depend upon these waters have observed over thousands of years. And I'm talking about the indigenous communities that are located on the Olympic coast that have always been there. So there are 4 tribes, as I hope I mentioned in the beginning. The Ho, the Quileute, the Quinault Indian Nation, and the Makah tribe are sovereign Indian nations. Because of treaties that they have signed with the US government, there is an agreement that they are sovereign governments in North America, in our country, and there's a government-to-government trust responsibility that means that the US, our federal government, has obligations to these tribal communities to manage healthy ecosystems that they depended on. So that they depend on now. Sorry, didn't mean to use past tense. Always have depended on. So this slide, you may notice the names of many Washington State, Western Washington State tribes on this map, but this map is incomplete because the tribes on this map only include the 20 treaty tribes of Western Washington. In other words, those tribes who are recognized as signers of mid-1800s federal treaties with the US government. This map does, however, include the 4 Olympic Coast tribes, the Ho that I spoke of, the Ho, the Makah, the Quileute, and the Quinault Indian nations. You can see where those reservations reside along this coast. And these are the tribes that are at the heart of the Olympic Coast Ocean Acidification Vulnerability Assessment that's depicted in this video. So I strongly encourage everyone to take a look at this resource, which following this video. This is a 4-page document that was prepared by the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission that really does a wonderful job of explaining tribal sovereignty, the treaties in Western Washington, in which these nations ceded their territories and agreed to live on reservation in exchange for the right to continue to fish, hunt, and gather in all of their traditional places. And it also talks about the battles that Western Washington tribes have had to see those rights upheld, culminating in a series of legal decisions only a few decades ago that finally guaranteed them the right to half of the harvestable salmon and shellfish that are harvested in our state waters, federal waters as well. And it also guarantees them the right to be co-managers of these natural resources. All right, so our collaborative research project is focused on the Olympic coast and these waters. And the Olympic coast waters are fundamental to indigenous ways of life and the indigenous communities that reside there, who have stewarded, studied, and depended on the ocean for thousands of years. And as you have heard, ocean acidification from me, ocean acidification is already having an effect in this region. And our research group feels the urgency to better understand and anticipate and prepare for these changes so that these tribal communities are able to cope and adapt in the next 10,000 years. But again, I'd rather let some of my collaborators on this project speak. So the next slide, oh, I'm sorry. I was going to be talking while I showed you this slide. Again, another map, but a very nice one showing the reservations. And I also wanted to point out that this is the boundary of the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, which is also a partner on this project. And this is a beautiful photo of the mouth of La Push Harbor, where the Quileute Indian Reservation is. And those are Quileute fishing boats going out to sea. Okay, now words from my wonderful partners. I hope this video plays well.
I mean, I'm an elder myself, but I still dig pretty good. I could probably dig 100 some pounds a day if I, you know, on a good day.
Okay. Next slide. That's Andy Mail, as it says, a Quinault elder, and this is a follow-on video.
I think there is an effect right now in the climate because, like you say, I've been digging since 1956. You know, I've been digging since 1956. Since I was 6 years old, 6 years old, I started digging, and I noticed just in the last maybe 4, 5, or 6 years, I noticed that the clams break a little easier when you take them out, because you go down, you grab the clam, and they snap a little bit, crack a little bit easier. Are they really getting thinner? Are the shells getting thinner? I don't know. I can't tell you for sure, but the only way to find out would be to measure the clams. Like if you find a midden from 1600s and measure the clam.
There we go. I love that statement by Andy, because it illustrates what I was trying to convey earlier, that people have been in this area for thousands of years and observing all the time and know so much and notice so much. There's no way that in intermittent observations that have been conducted in the past decades in this area can ever compare to the depth of this sort of knowledge. And I also just want to explain, for those who aren't familiar with the term midden, it's a pile, it's a place where clamshells would be discarded after the clams are consumed by tribal members, and these middens can date back centuries. So Andy, I think, told me that he had a midden that was probably hundreds of years old in his backyard. And what a resource to be able to return to those shells that are hundreds of years old and assess whether the shells from that period are stronger than what's happening, the shells today, and draw inferences about what ocean change may be doing in that case. All right, here's another collaborator from the Makah tribe.
Concerns with ocean acidification for the Makah tribe are really significant because of the reliance upon the marine resources that we have here and the changes that we see from the things that we know. So we know that we're looking at potentially some species not being able to remain in our area and new species coming in, and that really is a huge concern for us.
So I don't have good audio for Huishta, an elder with the Ho tribe, but in this picture, he is telling our one of our interviewers about all the species that are critical to his community. Manila clams, horse clams, crab, gooey duck, fish, and razor clams, they are important to all of us out here. So this final quote in this section is Joe Schumacher.
The Quinault Indian nation depends upon its coastal resources as they have for millennia. And anything that's out there lurking in the water that could be impacting those is a deep concern. What we don't know is the scariest part. What we do know is frightening.
So what Joe is speaking to there, what we don't know, at the beginning, we started this project, this collaboration in 2017 when we wrote a proposal to the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program for funding. And despite the complexity of the marine system represented in this infographic, which does in fact detail a lot of the kinds of information that has been generated over the last 2 decades about ocean acidification, there is, as I said, so much that we don't know about how ocean change is affecting these extremely complex systems. And one of the things that we know the least about at the beginning of this project, at least, is represented way over here on the right-hand side. This is a wonderful infographic, but it really does, it is representative of the OA science focus in the early years, which was on the ecosystem and impacts to people and how they are affected by changes to the ocean that they depend upon, really wasn't explored to the same extent in the early years. And so it's kind of telling that we have sort of a generic bathroom sign representation of people over here, just tucked away in the corner, and they're not an important part of this particular infographic. So over the, whoops, got to get back to, there we go. Over the last 5 years, NOAA's OA program emphasis really has begun to shift, actually since before then. But it began to shift from that focus on biological, physical, and chemical oceanography of OA and ocean change to a more holistic integration of vulnerable ecosystems with vulnerable human communities. So when we wrote this proposal, it was in response to a call for proposed research to meld social science with existing oceanographic information that had been generated over decades, and try to bridge what was happening in the marine environment with what may be happening and what could happen to human communities that are also vulnerable to OA. So an important objective of this research project depicted in the video was generating new social data and information through primary research. These are ethnographic and qualitative interviews with members of the tribal communities, participatory workshops within each of those communities to vet new information, and an assessment of the socioeconomic conditions, the context in which these tribal communities exist, that can really determine their ability to respond to and adapt to ocean change. So again, back to my colleagues, this is the Jan Newton, who is the co-lead PI and represents the oceanographic side of this project, talking about her goal for the project, which was to synthesize a lot of existing data. No, now I got to find that.
But what was really exciting about this project and the funding of NOAA is the recognition that to do a regional vulnerability assessment, what we really needed to do is synthesize these data and to put together the various scales, the physical and chemical measurements along with the biological observations, and to look at not only the conditions now, but also the projected conditions through computer modeling.
So before I leave this slide, I just want to point out that the 3 little inset photos here are representative of some of that data that Jan's referring to that has been synthesized for our project. This on the left-hand side is a buoy that was launched and is moored off the coast of the Quileute Reservation on La Push, and it collects information about harmful algal blooms. Up here in the upper right-hand corner, this is some of the monitoring of the health of the coastal razor clam population. This is a picture that was provided by a member of the Hoh tribe. So the Hoh contributed that data. And then in the bottom right is one of our project partners, Rio Foster, who's monitoring carbonate chemistry to monitor ocean acidification in the nearshore. So tribal partners were very important contributors of the data that Jan is speaking of, in addition to a wealth of data that has been collected by the University of Washington, other academic institutions, NOAA, and other partners, the Olympic National Marine Sanctuary and the Olympic National Park. So here is the other co-lead of our project, Melissa Poe, who has led the social science work.
From the get-go, tribal scientists and managers have really been central in leading the priorities and approach to this research. It's a really dynamic and diverse collaboration.
The inset pictures in this slide up in the upper right-hand corner, that's Melissa leading a workshop with Makah community members after extensive interview work to try to understand what resources were important to Makah community and how they were important, both socially, culturally, economically. And now she's taking that data back to the community and having them vet and rank it in terms of its importance. Like, and what the question types of questions she would ask them is, if you saw this particular species decline due to ocean change, how would that affect your well-being in these many different categories? And then she's also just greeting one of our partners, Justine James, in the bottom right. Okay. So this slide basically drives home the point, which is central to our research, that the ocean is integral to all aspects of tribal well-being. This was supported by the new social science that Melissa and another collaborator, Melissa Shutton, produced during the course of the project, which is wrapping up in about 2 months. But the starting assumptions of our project were that social vulnerability is a factor of the socioeconomic conditions that a community lives in. So it's not just about exposure to biological change and hazards, but it's also the risk experienced by these communities is exposure to social, political, economic, and demographic stressors. And that the sensitivity of communities is geographically and culturally specific. I failed to emphasize this point earlier, but the fact that these communities now reside on reservations on the coast, those reservations are their sovereign lands. That's what they were granted when signed the treaties, when they ceded all their other lands and resources. But they are rooted to those reservations. As ocean conditions change and species may move into more favorable regions, the tribal communities cannot move with them as they would have in the past. So they are really vulnerable because they cannot escape changes that are coming to their tribal lands. Okay, gonna move on to the next slide. This is a partner, Justine James. He's the cultural resource specialist with the Quinault Indian tribe, and speaking so beautifully about why natural resources to a tribal community are not simply about food or about a harvestable product that you can sell. It's about much more than that.
When I go to meetings, I bring smoked salmon, and everybody praises it for the taste and everything, and then I calmly look around the room and I said, this is also a cultural resource, because people just think of trees, things like that when they think about natural resources. They don't consider the spiritual side that a salmon brings to a tribal community.
So as I said, we're at the final months of this long-term collaboration, and the goal from the get-go was not simply to document the ways in which tribal communities are uniquely vulnerable to ocean change. It was to work in collaboration with these communities to also identify their strengths as communities, what is important to them, what allows them to be resilient, as they have been resilient for thousands of years, to environmental change. So some of the photos, these photos represent some of the ideas that tribal community members themselves identified as ways to keep their communities strong in the face of ocean change. In the upper right-hand corner, that's salmon smoking by the fire. It's a traditional food preparation. They identified traditional foods and knowledge of how to prepare those foods and traditions of sharing those foods within the community as something that strengthens them and something that they can turn to to bolster their communities against ocean change. Other things that they identified were education of their own tribal youth and opportunities for their tribal youth to become stewards of tribes' natural resources during the time of ocean change. And this image is of tribal members in a traditional canoe, resurrection of exchange between tribes in the Pacific Northwest. That's sort of symbolized by something called canoe journey, which is a resurrection of a tradition of traveling by canoe between various tribes' grounds and waters. That is something that's strengthening them spiritually, culturally, economically, and that is also viewed as something that can help tribes be more resilient as the ocean continues to change. So the final slide here, Rebecca Monette from the Makah tribe is once again speaking about her aspirations for the outcomes of this research.
I think if we got the community thinking realistically about alternatives or adaptations that could be made during a time of change, that would be success, I think, to just get folks ahead of the curve.
Okay. So a lot of that thinking did happen, and this is a very recently developed representation of our research approach and values that we all collectively brought to this project. On the outer ring are these very important values: that the research be relevant to the communities in which who are participating in it and on whose lands the research is being conducted. There should be reciprocity between the non-tribal researchers and the tribal partners. And of course, you've heard me say collaborative many times through this. This is knowledge co-production. This is not people from the University of Washington coming in from the outside and conducting their own independent research. This was very much from the get-go a collaboratively designed and executed project. And then finally, this idea that the outcomes and findings need to be actionable. We're not just trying to produce a report or even just a beautiful new infographic. We are trying to identify, create new knowledge that these tribal communities can act upon to become more resilient in the face of ocean change. And those actions should be at their discretion and tribally led by and for tribal members. So just one quick example before I finish up this webinar. You know that if we've been conducting this research over the past 3 to 4 years, that something happened in the middle of it, and that thing was a pandemic. And that pandemic definitely did make it difficult for us to complete some of our objectives. But it also created an opportunity for some of the findings to immediately benefit the tribal communities. And this example is specifically in the Makah community, because of those interviews and those workshops and the community identifying that traditional foods and food security and would help them be more resilient in the face of ocean change. They were also able to act on that information in the face of another stressor, COVID. And as a result of this groundwork that had been laid down by Melissa's, Poe, and Shutton, and all of our tribal partners in the Makah community, they were able to move quickly to harvest more traditional foods as COVID basically cut off their reservation from the outside world. So they were going to experience food security, but with external funds and a plan in place to take advantage of resources that were there, especially while their fishing fleet was not able to go out, they were able to turn to other traditional foods and sustain the community. And that would not have happened in the same way without this research. All right, returning to this infographic just briefly to remind you of what things looked like at the outset of our project. And this is a very recently completed infographic that was co-produced with all the members of the research team and vetted by all 4 tribal communities, that shows how that really fully integrates the tribal communities and these people into the system. So it's no longer just a sciencey, oceanographic, just the environment sort of depiction. This one has both and shows how these things are connected. So this is a recent product of our project that I really love and am proud of, and appreciate the work that went into it. So I think it's time for my thank you slide. I think I went a little over time. These are not even all the partners, but there are many people for whom I couldn't find photos, but ours is a large group. And over the years, we've met every other month, mostly virtually, and have really developed some lasting relationships, which I know will continue beyond the lifetime of this project. And that's an important outcome in itself, is the the deepening of respectful relationships between this entire team. So I promised you, so thank you to all of the partners, both the ones shown here and the ones who are not represented. Thank you to the NOAA OA program for funding this research. Thank you all for listening. Here's my email address. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or you want to follow up. And as promised, I'll leave you with this very busy resources slide and I'll leave it up during the Q&A. And you are welcome to take screenshots of this, but hopefully you can also copy and paste these links out of the chat box. And I'll take questions now, and I can also provide a little bit of an orientation to some of these resources, all of which are related to the project. Thank you. No, I'll leave my screen up and I'll just sit tight.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, thank you, Meg, for not only collaborating to do this very important work of assessing vulnerability to ocean change, how tribal communities may respond, but also your perspective and sharing these pieces of sort of the story of the project and what can be a tool for both education and communication. As Meg mentioned, all of the resources, Liz and Laura have been sharing those in the chat box, so you can find those links directly. And I think Liz will be facilitating what we hope will be a discussion. So please go ahead, don't hesitate, type your questions into the questions box for Meg, and we will open it up.
Great, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Meg, for the presentation today. It was very enlightening and really great to hear these different perspectives and about this great collaboration with all these partners. Again, just a reminder, as Jen just mentioned, please put any questions or comments into the questions box so that we can communicate that. We're getting some praise from some of our participants, Meg, of that it was awesome to work with you, and this was a great presentation, sharing a lot of important information. As people consider putting some of these questions in, I'll just ask you, you mentioned that this is more than just providing a great infographic for different users, that, the purpose of this is to arm people with solutions to protect against some of the vulnerabilities you talked about. And so can you talk a little bit about any ability for any immediate actions that people were able to take during these COVID times, or sort of next steps that you heard about from your partners?
Well, the example that I gave earlier is foremost in my mind as a concrete, immediate action that really came out of this project, and equipping the Makah community to be more food secure. Some of the funding that came in from outside was able to pay for food processing equipment, I believe, and the development of establishing of sort of formal food sharing protocols so that no one in the community would go hungry. In that case, as I said, the fishing boat fleet was grounded for a time during the COVID crisis, and the community was able to harvest elk, which live in the tribal lands, and process and distribute that meat to community members. And they were poised to do this because of the work that the social science work that had occurred in that community. And it's not a one and done thing. This sort of reinvigoration of use of traditional foods is something that's going to continue, and thank goodness, because apparently so is the pandemic. But another example, as I said, this pandemic occurred in the middle of our research project, and even though our research team is fairly far flung, we even have important research collaborators on the East Coast at this point. We were always so physically spread out that we weren't going to be meeting in person all that much. But just being pushed onto entirely virtual spaces for the most part. I would say that this project probably, and the work that we were doing, which felt very significant to so many of us on the team, really helped us come together in a way that probably doesn't otherwise happen when you're working entirely virtually. And as I said, one of the outcomes of this project is that we are committed to being long-term partners with these communities, and they to us, to continue this work well beyond the end of this particular research grant from the OA program. We're poised to take advantage of future funding opportunities or to create our own. Another example of something that has sort of grown up alongside this project since the beginning is the Olympic Coast OA Sentinel site, which is a very, which is a group effort that's led by the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, but involves pretty much all the partners from this research team and more, who are trying to establish that entire Olympic Coast area as a site for really effective and comprehensive research, both biological, physical, chemical research, but also social science, but also to leverage all that research into public outreach. And so that is another, I would say, outcome of this research is the solidification of the Olympic Sentinel site, which is now an official thing and will soon have a website. I regret that I can't give you that website yet, but it's coming. And it's going to be a wonderful way for people to stay in touch with this region and what's happening there and what people are doing to respond to it.
Great, thanks for that description on continued efforts and the ability to leverage sort of the outcomes and processes through this funded opportunity, not only for future opportunities, but also these relationships with these partners that you talked about. I was thinking, you know, for the communicators and educators in our audience, are there a few take homes that you would wish to continue to pass on to that group of people? I know you had a lot of really great take homes from the perspectives, not only from yourselves and, you know, the research teams, but, you know, the research teams in these tribes and other partners. Anything that you want to leave those communicators and educators with, as well as the scientists in the audience?
I think, no, I hadn't considered this beforehand. For me, there's been so much learning for me personally as part of this project. This was really the first time I was closely involved with social science research. So I have gained a vast appreciation and understanding for what social science is and what its value is. And I think an important take home is that you have to have both types of science to be meaningful to people and to end up with outcomes that are actionable. If you don't, if all you're doing is measuring salinity, and no, I do no offense to the very important work of measuring salinity. It's led to real insights along the coast about the oceanographic conditions. It's important. But if all you did was that, how would you know how to act? Because ultimately, what is going to motivate people to act to do something about climate change and ocean acidification is when they feel personally involved. And until you can see either things happening to yourself, or you can understand how climate change and ocean change is impacting people and communities that you care about, you aren't going to act. And so it's critical to always integrate social science from the beginning of a project and think about that. And to educators, please encourage your students to grow up and be social science scientists. And there's so many ways that you can be a quote unquote social scientist. You don't have to necessarily be an academic or a federal employee. Jen Mintz and I were talking last week about how educating is very much a social science. Jen may want to comment on that. You are living it in your classrooms, and you're cognizant about the way people receive and use information. So you already understand how important it is.
Great. Anything to add to that, Jen? Otherwise, we'll move to a comment in our question box.
Meg summarized it elegantly. Yeah.
So we do have a comment here by Ann Penn Charles, who I believe was one of the partners on this project.
Hello, Ann.
And Ann writes that this also gave them the opportunity to harvest roots, berries, forest products that they eat for traditional feasts and be able to preserve the vegetables and fruits from their tribal greenhouses to produce and dehydrate and preserve. They were then able to hand this out with the seafood that was gathered and dropped off to the elders and others in need of subsistences. They were able to provide to their food banks and get their traditional foods as well as the local food bank items to support these communities. So just some more information there on that kind of adaptability, but still maintaining those traditional foods.
Thank you so much for that comment, Ann. Ann is a member of the Quileute tribe. The example I spoke of earlier was specific to the Makah tribe, but absolutely some of the same ability to respond, as she noted, was carried out in other tribes as well. And I just want a particular note of appreciation, Ann Penn Charles, who is the focus, well, who is a star of one of these resources. It is the CBS News short video, Rising Ocean Waters Threaten Tribal Lands. That's about sea level rise that is literally today, right now, flooding the Quileute community of La Push on the coast. And I know that Ann is a anchor in her community. She's probably, the fact that she took time to attend this webinar, I'm so grateful, because she's probably also wading through the water, helping other members of her community. And it's an honor. It's been an honor to have her in this project, and she's a lovely person. I'm so glad that you got to hear from her.
Great. And she said, yes, my house and others were affected with recent floods.
Yeah.
So we have 1 minute left. I don't know if that's enough time for you to orient us to maybe your top one resource you'd like to share, or any closing words.
Yeah, let me see if I could do this. Boy, oh boy. One thing that I really didn't emphasize too much in this talk was some fantastic work by some of our partners, Dr. Sam Sidlecki and her graduate student, Hallie Berger, who are currently at the University of Connecticut, about to look very closely at how ocean change is affecting Dungeness crab, which is one of the critical species to many of the tribes in this part of the Olympic coast. And they were able to look at OA effects across the entire life cycle. And crab were one of the focal species to come out of this research. And so there's an article about the impacts to Dungeness crab, which I hope everyone will take a look at.
Thank you for that. And that link is in the chat. And of course, you can also view it again when you receive the recordings of this presentation. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jen. Thank you again, Meg.
Awesome. Thank you, Meg, not only for the interesting, engaging presentation, but insights and answers to questions as well. As Liz mentioned, we will share the recording and links to the resources mentioned by Meg today in the Source Webinar archive in the Google Drive. That will be within a week's time. And as Meg offered graciously, if there's any questions we didn't get to, please feel free to go ahead and email her directly. Her email can also be found in the questions box. And we just want to thank, as Meg has, as Liz has, thank you for taking the time to join us today. As mentioned, we welcome feedback, questions, suggestions for topics, and you can submit those by replying to the follow-up email you receive, or you'll also have the opportunity to provide feedback with a survey that will appear right after you hop off of the webinar. And we would really, really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to complete that, as that feedback is what really allows us to continue to host this series and inform others of its impact. So we would like to just mention before we hop off, of course, our next webinar, you can check the source website shown here for that. And for those who aren't aware, the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program did just open a funding opportunity in late December, so you may have missed it over the new year. But this, our education mini grant program is accepting proposals now until February 18th for projects that engage diverse audiences in ocean acidification education and outreach, match ocean acidification communication needs with existing research, education, and outreach activities, and develop innovative approaches for community involvement, particularly with a focus in inland and underserved communities, and or those do not have to go together. So please go ahead, you can follow our website and you will find that more details right on our homepage there. And thank you all. Thanks to Meg again, and thank you each for taking the time to join us. And with that, we will end today's session.